Okay, we will begin. Welcome to the Visiting Writers Series, our second event of the spring here at Carthage College. We're sponsored by the English Department and the Division of Arts and Humanities. Thank you all very much for being here on a windy, there's a gale, at least a warning. A watch warning, I still don't know which is worse. Whichever is worse.
The warning. Yeah, the warning.
I'm very happy to welcome tonight two of my favorite writers in the world, Jordan Dunn and Lisa Fishman. And before I tell you more about them, I'm going to tell you about two upcoming events that are also very exciting. Next week, a week from Thursday, again in Neiman at 6 o'clock, Rafael Dalio will give a talk titled Voodoo Islands, the U.S. Occupation of Haiti and Caribbean Blackness, part of his current work on how Caribbean writers and thinkers push us to think differently about the human. And Daniel Quiles, thank you, whose work focuses on Argentinian conceptualism, as well as broader questions related to new media and politics in Latinx and Latin American art, will give a talk with the enticing title, Babalu on the Gong Show, Tony Labat's Diasporic Media. If you don't know what the Gong Show was, you can look it up after the reading and you'll enjoy that. And then on May 1st, on Monday, Carthage professor Casey Caldwell will speak on queer procreation and urban belonging in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. So look out for reminders about those events. Okay, so we're going to begin tonight's reading with Lisa Fishman, author of the newly published World Naked Bike Ride. Raise your hand if you've participated in the World Naked Bike Ride. Seen the World, Jordan, have you seen or seen it? I know every year when you work at the farmer's market, it's a big day when World Naked Bike Ride goes around the square, the local version, and you get to see that happen. So it is a real thing in that sense, and now it's a real book, which is maybe one of the kinds of things that happen in this book, where things are real in more than one place. Lisa Fishman is a dual US-Canadian writer whose debut fiction collection, World Naked Bike Ride, has just been released on Gaspereau Press. And it's a really gorgeous book. Come and take a look at it after the reading, even to buy a copy if you don't have one, or just to see the cover is beautifully letterpress printed. It's extremely beautifully made book as well. And that press is in Nova Scotia, where much of the book was written. Her 7 books of poetry include Mad World, Mad Kings, Mad Composition from Wave Books in 2020, 24 pages and other poems, and The Happiness Experiment, and then 2 others, Dear Reed and Flower Card, that are here. She has new work in Granta and is anthologized in Best American Experimental Poetry and elsewhere. And she currently teaches at Columbia College Chicago and is the director of the MFA program in creative writing there. Some years ago, I don't know how many, Lisa Fishman felt an urge to write stories. We heard about this in class. As she writes in the book that resulted from this urge, not to say obsession even, with writing stories, she writes, it was not a likely time for stories, but some of us wanted to hear stories. And these are certainly stories I wanted to hear and had not heard before. Stories in which a stone, a song, a coffee maker, a hat, or, as she writes in Magic, a sureness shaped around a gap, become an occasion for questions, wonder, inversions, patience, and stories. Of her poetry, the great Chinese poet Bei Dao wrote, Lisa Fishman's minimalism creates uncanny space between lines in which more is given than seems told, as in Chinese classical paintings. Her syntax sometimes seems quite broken. Her syntax, sometimes quite broken, is harmonized by concrete evocative texture. She conducts finely tuned words and lets them echo each other. In these stories, at least in my reading of them, the syntax is filled or fulfilled or mended, as Festi might say, And the reader experiences this sentence from a conversation, one of the stories in the book, as an account of her own reading. That is, when you're reading the book and you come upon this character Bruno having this thought, it felt to me like my experience or an experience that somebody might have reading the book. Bruno was asking a question he had not expected to ask, and the flame in his heart leapt up. To find out what happens next, please welcome Lisa Fishman.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you all for coming and being here. I had a great time this morning in one of your classes, creative writing class, and I'm happy to see some of you here who were there. All right. I hope for those students that it's okay to start with a story I know that you've talked about, Mean Sometime in Halifax. I'm going to look for little nods or like, no, do a different one, as if you'll really do that. But yeah, so I'll try to make it fresh. If the phrase is confusing, mean sometime, it will definitely be probed within the story because it's also strange for the narrator. Okay, mean sometime in Halifax. Oh, and it begins by referring to a writer, a novelist named Edna O'Brien. I believe that when you hear Jordan tonight, or those of you who were in the class that Jordan came to this morning, Jordan spoke about books being made of other books and how books come from books. And so Edna O'Brien is, a modern Irish novelist, and something from one of her books begins this particular story. Something from one of her stories begins this story. Okay. I was thinking about Edna O'Brien and a sentence she wrote. Can I start over? I'm getting used to being up here. Okay. And we just had a glass of wine. I was thinking about Edna O'Brien and a sentence she wrote. Everything began to be better for Mrs. Reinhardt from the moment she started to sleepwalk. At the time that I was thinking about Edna O'Brien's sentence about Mrs. Reinhardt, I was walking from one winding path to another and crossing unexpected footbridges over streams. Some of the paths lead to fountains and some to a large pond where people used to skate all winter when the pond still froze in the public gardens. All of the paths are shaded by towering trees, so many that it is really a garden of trees, carefully tended so as not to become a forest. I noticed that I had been mistaken about when a particular oak tree was planted. I had told a friend that George V planted it, but this time I saw that it was George VI who planted it in 1939. I remembered that I wanted to tell another friend about the giant American chestnut in the southwest corner of the garden, one of the few surviving chestnuts of its age. The weeping European beech is another to marvel at. Who would believe such a tree exists? Underneath it, a bench faces a fountain in which 7 angels ride on serpents, or maybe they are dolphins, with fish leaping beside them. To arrange to meet someone there would be to fall in love instantly, there under the leafy canopy of the weeping beech, and you look around to see if anyone is on their way to it now. Edna O'Brien's sentence, everything began to be better for Mrs. Reinhardt from the moment she started to sleepwalk, seemed to me to contain a great secret about the very nature of reality, but perhaps the author or Mrs. Reinhardt was thinking more particularly about marriage. How the sentence might apply to the nature of reality or marriage or to other things entirely, things that I felt the sentence was just on the brink of disclosing, was ambiguous, even though the tone is matter-of-fact. I read it out loud to my husband over the phone that night, and he laughed. I read it out loud to my sister the next day, and she cleared her throat and laughed. In my family, the women clear their throats when they are not sure whether to laugh or what to say. Also, the two responses can be combined, as my sister showed by clearing her throat and then laughing. There is another sentence I would have liked reading out loud to my sister or to any number of people over the phone. It is not about the sleepwalking Mrs. Reinhardt, but about someone named Mr. Carmody, and it too was written by Edna O'Brien. He could not tell a story until he had ruined it first by describing its significance. When I first read it, I thought it was no wonder so many people seem to have been in love with Edna O'Brien in real life. She appears, she is 92 now, to be the sort of person who can make people laugh or clear their throats and want to know how her mind works, how she knows what she knows about both sleepwalking and storytelling. What most stood out to me in the public gardens when I was thinking about Mrs. Reinhardt and Edna O'Brien was something I hadn't noticed when I was there before, even though I must have walked past it several times. A mounted sundial beside one of the paths. The sundial is about knee-high, as corn should be by the 4th of July, according to my husband. I don't know how to read a sundial, so I looked at the shadow without interpreting it in relation to the time. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but I could not see how that was indicated by the shadow. Still more perplexing is the relief printing on the sundial's concrete base, which reads, "Mean sun time in Halifax is 1 hour, 14 minutes behind Atlantic Daylight Time." I have never heard of mean sun time and do not know if this is a form of time particular to Halifax or if it is universal but not commonly known in those terms. It has a more pagan sound, sun time does, than standard time. Clearly, the two ways of designating time, mean sun time and Atlantic Daylight Time, are not interchangeable, since the sun time of a place, at least in Halifax, is different from daylight or standard time. At least, I presume that Atlantic Daylight Time is another way of saying Atlantic Standard Time, but that may not be an accurate presumption. How many different times could it be in Halifax at, say, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on how you are referring to it? That there could be, or rather that there is, a difference of not just an hour, but an hour and 14 minutes remains mystifying to me. I had learned, listening to the car radio infrequently over a period of weeks, that between Nova Scotia and the neighboring province of Newfoundland, there is a difference of half an hour, not an hour. When it is 11 a.m. in Nova Scotia, it is either 10:30 or 11:30. It is either 10:30 or 11:30 in Newfoundland. I can't remember which. I had just gotten used to hearing both times announced on the radio at regular intervals, and now this. In Halifax, sun time is 1 hour and 14 minutes behind daylight time, and then half an hour before later than Newfoundland. I realize that it is the year 2022, and all of my questions could easily be answered if I typed them into the computer. I could receive the answers before ever even having written out what I had noticed and wondered about. I could do so now and explain the difference between mean sun time and Atlantic Daylight Time, as someone like Mr. Carmody might do. In this case, there would be no story if I had gotten all the answers by using a virtual search engine as soon as the questions popped into my head. However, it seems to me that having questions about things, the kinds of questions that sit with you or haunt you or return to you because you don't, in fact, immediately get them answered, can lead to other questions or ideas that may not be directly related to the first question. What is the prognosis for them, the things that require being thought about or mused upon, that may even require being written down so as to be looked at, not looked up, both closely and from a distance, from this perspective or that, in order to bring some other question or idea, or even a person whom you do not know, into being? I had a feeling that there was a certain imaginary person whom I wanted to ask about the difference between sun and daylight times, and maybe about how to read a sundial too. but the person has stayed hovering at the edges of my mind or imagination or memory. There is no search I can do to flush her or him or them out, and so I will have to be patient. It is even possible that such a person might appear in my sleep, and that I may not remember upon waking how my questions were answered. In which case, there they will remain, in the daylight or suntime of being awake, walking around without me, so to speak, living their lives as questions do. Yeah, I haven't read that one before ever at any of the readings I've been giving since the book came out. So thank you for being the debut audience for that. And as I was thinking about starting with it, I thought there was something about it that was helpful to me in sort of thinking about how a story may come to be written, that's sort of written into that one. Okay, so remember masks, the mask, right? They make an appearance here, and I'll just give one little prefatory remark that in Canada, where I was in the winter of 2021, the whole attitude across the country was very, very consistent for the most part, much more so than here, and strict about the wearing of masks. So that comes into the piece. Hello, Noah and Noah's class. Yeah, plenty of chairs up here. Promise not to let saliva come and spatter on you, as happens in the theater a lot. And also, any sci-fi people in here? There's a little bit of like my, because the whole situation during the pandemic felt to me like science fiction, or a version of it, you know, I went back to reading some sci-fi, and so some of those ideas in the most, you know, minimal way from a couple of Arthur C. Clarke stories, for example, and from Isaac Asimov's little magazine come in for a moment. They make cameo appearances. Okay, ear to the ground. Aaron found Jonathan with his ear to the ground and asked him why. A long time ago, someone had offered to share a plate of fried potatoes and peppers with him in a diner, and Aaron had that look, as if her question were a fork she was offering. Here, try this. He told her about his theory that the least perceptible sounds, such as that of an earthworm tunneling underground or an ant breathing, could become deafeningly loud by means of a complicated set of mathematical equations being performed silently by the person with his ear to the ground. Erin had no real notion of what it would mean to perform an equation. She pictured someone scribbling at a chalkboard instead of breaking open a stone, which is what Jonathan said he meant. The extremes under which they were living at the time of their meeting, while in many other places, many more millions of people were living in conditions far more extreme, had altered Erin's habits. She had stopped writing by hand, and she had stopped changing her clothes, and she had stopped washing her feet before bed, although she had not stopped walking barefoot around town. She had not stopped grinding her teeth or keeping her nails cut short, so short that her fingertips were often infected where the nail bed was exposed. Wearing a mask and a hat with a wide brim, she didn't care what she looked like because only her eyes and eyebrows were visible. Jonathan's eyes were wary, she thought, but his eyebrows, as if in defiance of the cautiousness she read in his eyes, were expressive, and she read them as friendly. All of this transpired, well, through his mask. Jonathan explained how he thought it might be possible to create a sort of reverse sonic mirror by which the frequency of sound vibrations were subject to inversion, such that the loudest sounds became faint, and conversely. He shared with Aaron his suspicion that the rate at which the planet was spinning had increased, and that this factored into his equations. When they walked off to find a rock to break open, Aaron considered how little was left to tell of any two people's stories once they met and had a conversation. Okay, this next sentence is true. The country's chief public health officer had almost, it seemed to her, issued the warning that people should not kiss without wearing masks. Very strict in Canada. Moreover, she surmised that people should not engage in sexual relations involving bodily contact of any kind without a mask. Such speculation and the context in which it arose was having an ineffable effect on narrative, as Aaron perceived it. Normally, she tended to interpret interactions between people as narratives that went toward or away from a few different possible ends. Now she was paying more attention to other things, the trajectories of which seemed equally limited. That is, the ends of things did not appear, as a general category or notion, to hold promise, in the sense of being capable of opening up yet other narratives with other possible ends. While she talked with Jonathan and heard about his ridiculous quest, or as he called it, his logical hypothesis, she was at one remove. Even if they went home together, she thought, they wouldn't see each other's faces. It did not occur to her that anyone would flout the chief public health officer's recommendation. And that cast a peculiar light on the idea that the sound of an earthworm tunneling underground could be as loud as a train going by. But how to interpret the peculiarity, she didn't yet know. Jonathan, meanwhile, was surprised by the force of memory and the harsh fluorescent light he could still see over the table in the diner where he had once been offered fried potatoes off someone else's fork. That was decades ago, when nothing like the present was imagined as a plausible future except in science fiction. He heard himself talking about vibration and resonance, and he was confused about time as he did so. Specifically, he was surprised by the resonance of memory, just as Aaron was surprised by the up and down movement of his eyebrows as he talked. This could be all I will ever see of your face, she thought, even if we become friends. But she did not say it out loud. Is it possible to see resonance, she was asking inwardly, aware of bits and pieces of remembrance moving in the air around their heads, being carried along on currents of air that the slightest movements of anyone altered and displaced. Not just around our bodies, she was thinking, but inside too, breathed in and breathed out by every animal and plant alive. Okay, so that's my pandemic story. And Rick, I know that you were hoping I might read a conversation.
Yeah.
Audience interaction here. But also your students know that one quite well. And so I think maybe I'll read a different one.
Okay.
A weird one with cake in it. How does that sound? Orbital cake. 156. Orbital cake. What's the joke? They said at the same time. And then, what is the sadness? It was the cake that was sad. The 6-inch cake with orange curd and marmalade plus sour cream and candied orange peel. Orbital cake, the baker called it, because the first two letters, O and R, matched up with what was in the cake other than sadness. Orange curd and orange marmalade, not to mention butter and sour cream, melted inside, carrying the sadness all through the cake while it was baking. At first, when they asked their questions, they knew what they were asking, and then they didn't. It was as if a pre-existing snag in their sweaters got a dog's tooth caught in it at the same time, in both sweaters at the same time, so that for each of them, the snag became a hole the tooth could fit into. "We can put bites of cake there," one said, and the other did, pushing fingerfuls of gold yellow crumbs through the space the dog's tooth had opened in the wool. As the spaces got bigger, they were able to fit whole pieces of cake into the holes the snags had become. They took turns doing this until the cake was gone. Then their sweaters, stuffed and smeared with crumbs and cream and lacquer-colored marmalade, not only were marred by a single snag that had turned into a tooth-sized hole, but also had begun to unravel in more than one place. It was becoming hard to keep each other in sight now that their sweaters were unraveling. Even from the beginning, they remembered, the only thing they had recognized about each other were their shoes, which they took off now and threw into the sea. The end. All right, two more really short ones, short as in a paragraph. Magic. Here it is summer, and Else has forgotten something. She knows she has forgotten something. It is a distinct feeling, but she does not know what she has forgotten. The distinct feeling is a sureness shaped around a gap. Another time, she was remembering what hadn't happened yet. Andre had not yet pulled a hat out of a rabbit's mouth, but he would do so when she forgot. Now there was black silk sliding along the rabbit's pink tongue. Hat coming out. Else put her hand to her head. Midnight. Else held her hand over her ear, and half the music got louder. She covered her other ear, not at the same time, and the other half of the music got smaller. But that did not account for how bright the music felt when she lay under the piano with neither ear covered. It had grown to the size of a dolphin, and the night sky was bluer than usual. Else thought of the ocean and considered standing on her head. If music came from the ocean, she wanted to hear it there, where you could be upside down without holding still. Else placed both hands on top of her eyelids. Truly, she could hear best near the water. Thank you. Let's hear some poetry.
Thank you, Lisa. That was beautiful. If you really want to know how that story ends,
That's right. We didn't get to that.
it's right over there. That was great. Our next reader is Jordan Dunn, author of Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action, which some of you know who are reading it in class, but others of you have not seen it yet. A really beautiful book as object and book as words that one encounters and draws into one's mind. There are like beautiful images and pages that you can see, and all from the public domain, as you'll probably hear about. And these books are over here, along with other books, and some books that Jordan made himself. He designed this one. So Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action was published by Partly Press in 2022. And Jordan is also the author of numerous pamphlets and ephemeral prints, including Common Names, Reactor Woods, The Land of Little Rain, and Cedar Lake, August 2nd, 2017. He lives with his family in Madison, Wisconsin, where he edits and publishes Oxide Press, and you can see a lot of the beautiful things he's making there at oxidepress.org. When I first read a manuscript of Jordan Dunn's Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action, I was a bit lost. In the way I, at least, have sometimes become lost, following perhaps a path that turns out to be a drainage and ends at a cliff, or an animal trail that slowly seems to shrink until one is crawling through a thicket. or a sentence that leads one to such an unexpected and distant end that one reads it again to confirm that one had not begun to dream somewhere along the way. And then when one does find one's way home, how glorious and strange it is, as strange as the field when one returns to it. As Jordan writes in My Lack of Stillness, what you will find is intellectual being, local divisions, and emptiness in the descriptions of native forbs and grasses planted directly into revision. All the realms are woven together in this book in a constantly shifting surface, a new public domain that we can all get lost in together. Please welcome Jordan Dunn.
How's everyone? How are you? I'm going to take a sip of water. If only all of your professors were willing to crawl through thickets when the trails became narrow, I believe it would be a better world. So let me set a timer here. So I'm going to read a little bit from physical geography. And then I'm going to read a little bit from a manuscript, which Rick was interested in me reading from. And I'll read from those two things, and that will be my reading. Can you hear me in the back okay? Yeah? Okay. So one of the things that I like about making a book that's full of many parts and that can be accessed from many different directions is that I get to read it a different way each time. And so I've never read a full page out loud, and I'm not going to tonight either. And the way that I like to read it is sort of thinking of drawing a thread through it. I do some bookbinding, and I like the way that a linen thread is able to bind pages together. And so I drew a thread through here yesterday and created a line that I'm going to read to you now. Physical geography is modified by human action. Everything is here as it happens because we are wedded to the afterglow of words. Acknowledgments of landscapes taken into the mind, then filtered back out of the mind. After you have looked at the picture of the blue flower, I wish you could tell me what it means to pivot heavenward regardless of the output data. On the other hand, we could return cheerfully to the swift and subtle generosities provided by swallows this time of year. They retain the moistures of rains and dews. The air swarmed with them to invite melodious passions from points of inner heat and phosphorescence that excite remarkably as a kingfisher dips and then rises. Where the pond meets its spring water, the swaying of the tree from the action of the wind, and all the visible works of God in particular. Bats drink on the wing, like swallows, by sipping the surface, as they play over pools and streams, their action on light in a region of clouds and phosphorescence, the rainbow iris and dewdrops, balancing our movement. Each observation is exactly the same in spirit. Its absorption and reflection of light, minuteness of the ultimate particles of matter. The outer creation provides language for descriptions of the inward creation, bundled by repetition and soft nourishment in the combinations of becoming, like blossoms opened upon the waterscape, water lily sightline. Like thin histories developing side points to vanish within the conditions of dusk. Keep the smoke heavy. Carried off to carry light into and around our correlation, separating my limits from their own design. The dragonflies appear, and one attempts to comprehend their flight patterns by studying the swift moving waters of the creek. and the interplay of their shadows upon the swift-moving waters of the creek. There are histories hollowed out side by side, like a sculpture of a tree pictured with an empty kind of beauty at the clear-cut site of its origin. Let us interrogate the great apparition that must shine so peacefully around us. Let us define its limits before we understand its origin. Okay, so when I was preparing to read this piece, I was trying to figure out how much I could read in about a 10-minute period of time. And I was looking up words per minute, and I know that I talk kind of slowly, and I kind of have this monotone voice. And I was looking up, like, I kind of tested and see, like, how much do I read in a minute? And I'm like, okay, it's about this much. And then I found a comparison chart. And apparently I read at about the speed that Winston Churchill would give speeches, which I don't know is a good thing, but it's at least interesting to know that someone can be successful and talk at about 130 words per minute. Okay. So let me explain this book a little bit, which is, well, it's still a manuscript, but it feels like a book. Because once you've had a manuscript turn into a book, you're convinced that all manuscripts will turn into books, even though they don't. But it's one long sentence that's about 70 pages long. And whether or not it's grammatically correct is probably up for debate. But one of the things that it does is it uses a lot of intertexts that are quoted and a lot of writing of Rick's. And some of my friends, but also a bunch of authors who I admire. And often there will just be a comma, and then a quote will start, but it won't necessarily have something to do with what came before it. And so there's similar kinds of interjections to what happens here. But one of the things that I did with that book is I used em dashes as a way to sort of create portals between places in time. And so what I've done here is I've just reorganized a number of the pieces. So I've taken away sections between em dashes and sort of reorganized them here for this reading. And so this is probably the only way this work will ever be read in this particular order. Preface. And the piece is called Walking. Walking. Rick mentioned his friend, a visual artist, who would always make studies before a major work. And it never occurred to Rick that a writer could do that too. And how he, Rick, was most attracted to his friend's studies for larger works, not the works themselves. My explaining to Laura yesterday how I no longer want to write, but simply to walk, and have my body record a line of text that doesn't resemble writing, but resembles the feeling of reading when printed, like an infinite spectrogram that performs a binding in its wake. Therefore, I do not even need to print it because it will print itself, and bind itself and appear in chronological order upon the bookshelf. And the collection of these walks will be my life's work. Not even notes for the larger work, but a larger work composed of notes. I follow the shoreline to a tunnel that opens onto a hidden cliff-backed beach, only accessible at low tide. There is a moment when the light from the opposite end is not enough to guide my feet over the driftwood that was strewn across the tunnel by violent winter storms. And I move forward step by step to feel my footing until there is enough light to reach the tunnel end, and I emerge onto a secluded beach where I read, and a high, slow turning of gulls, gliding and hanging, dropping and rising. Joy samples its levels. And although I know joy is the feeling I am walking toward, there is no reaching it except in the poem. Several pelicans are fishing out by the larger sea stacks. They hover above the white caps before diving and dart down fast into the water. A mist hovers at eye level across the beach, and I step from rock to rock while the wet sand is washed regularly by the rising and retreating waves. The overpowering sound of the waves crashing against the rock startles me as a rush of water sneaks up over my feet and retreats. It is a small, gilded fear, trembling in the sunlight, that is now arching over the cliff to clear the fog as I re-enter the tunnel. So that instead of drifting into sleep, I slid into my memories, or rather, the memories, at least so it seemed to me, rose higher and higher in some space outside of myself, until, having reached a certain level, they overflowed from that space into me, like water over the top of a weir. I close my eyes and sit upright in bed. My failure to desire desiring at this juncture as the wind picks up outside, and its background hush mimics this slow unfolding while I count breaths. Attempt to dissipate the sleeplessness before me, as if the thought which brushes against the moment could pass by, in its near weightlessness, and be replaced by another, instead of embedding itself sharply so as to cause a miniature throbbing that the meditated breath merely accentuates in the small gap between the inhale and the exhale. There is your mind at work again, I tell myself, like the infinite arc of omniscience that fails to dissolve its own self-recognition. But awaiting, just as is not related to the future any more than to an accessible past, is also the awaiting of awaiting, which does not situate us in a present. For I have always already awaited what I will always wait for. I step down the narrow forest path bordered by violets and archangel to reach the less crowded forest floor, where I pinch off a single flower from the wild leeks whose umbels nod among trilliums in the afternoon light. And as the rich garlicky scent rises from the flower and disperses into the morning air, I carry it with me on my fingertips further down the trail, where the word allium stirs a memory, for a reason I cannot properly define, of one afternoon when I sat with Lisa on her front porch before her manuscript in a bowl of Concord grapes, where she explained to me how she didn't want the project I was printing for her to be presented loosely, because there was a power, perhaps even a somewhat mystical power, if I remember her explanation correctly, that is exercised when paper is bound together in the book form. And I related what she was saying in part to the power of folding paper, that once a sheet is folded into a new shape, it is forever something different than what it was originally. Its essence has changed, even though the trace of its origin remains the same. I wake in the poet's house from a dream softened by my knowledge of having fallen asleep here several hours earlier, my realizing then in the darkness that perhaps the dreams of the poets were stored in the floorboards and the walls in such a way that my own dreams could speak to them or trace the memory of their manifestation. And this thought guided me back into a deep sleep, such that in waking now I remember the soft comfort it afforded me, and the symmetry between waking then and now and the dream between these waking moments that was in itself a kind of awakening, has left me feeling rested, as though I have completed a poem that was only accessible to my dreaming self, and which prepared me to awaken and begin a different poem here in the morning. Remembering now, after Brad's parents returned from the funeral home, how Nikki had carried the clothes she had chosen for Brad back inside and placed them on the counter. Then she took me aside and explained that the funeral director had advised against even a private viewing. Recognizability, I'm thinking, as I chop the chives and strip the oregano and add them to the cast iron pan where the beet greens are sautéing. As the kitchen fills with the scent of the herbs, as I stir them in the pan and then fold them into the greens, as several measures of memory are compared in the reactivation of a single moment in time, in the precision of the language in establishing blame. The Genie S85 incident boom lift, which was designed, manufactured, tested, inspected, and distributed by defendants Terex and Genie, and was leased and or rented by defendant Herc to defendant Pickathon and or the Guildworks defendant in the summer of 2019, continued to tip approximately 110 degrees, with both Sweat and Blackmore on the platform, until it impacted the ground. Both Sweat and Blackmore suffered traumatic brain injuries and were declared deceased at the site by the medical examiner. And the echo of Luke's text, on the day of the accident. Call me as soon as you see this. Like a pinch in the arm as I set pasta to boil and remove the cast iron pan from the flame. Are we in the middle of one of your poems? Zoe asks, as Benjamin breaks challah and passes it around the table. The question arising from my description of a feeling upon waking in the afternoon from a nap, in which memory was not a narrative structure, but rather a vast heap of experience tangled together in the most inextricable form, where only edges were visible, and I had to climb upon the heap of my memory in order to extract even the smallest fragment. This being my description of the feeling of waking, and not of the dream. My thinking now about the light in René's study passing through his kaleidoscope, which I read before I lay down for a nap. When I first held the kaleidoscope up to my left eye and turned my face toward the window, certain rays of the same sunlight that passed through the glass marble and then through the metal tube towards my eye would have traveled past my face and then across the room, and would then have reached the book mentioned. Today, however, while I write these words, I am unable to recall, let alone to report, what I saw while I looked down the tube and through the glass marble and into the afternoon sunlight. The dream itself was staged in a reading room in Memorial Library in Madison, in which everything I had ever printed and wrote was placed on long tables, and people I didn't recognize were wandering the aisles between the tables, stopping now and again to pick up an item which they examined from several perspectives, but did not, as far as I could tell, actually read any of the language printed on the pages. And in the far corner by the north-facing window sat Andy, who wore a bow tie and a bowler's hat, eating from a container of service berries, which he had just picked from the trees whose limbs were visible if one approached the windows and looked down to the street below. And when he started speaking, I couldn't understand a word he was saying, because it sounded very much like a pretend language he would, in waking life, make up as a kind of art or to accompany one of his songs. When I asked him what he meant, he offered me some service berries. Then he pointed to a sheet on the edge of the closest table, on which was printed an etymology. The name serviceberry has its own folklore, dating back to pioneer days, when the showy flowering, marking the end of winter, coincided with memorial services for people who died during the winter season. According to some, services were deferred until blooming signaled the time when the soil could be turned over and the bodies buried in the ground. Thank you. And I guess I would like to thank all of you for coming. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Rick.
That was, yeah, thank you both. That was very beautiful reading. Would you like to have casual conversation at the book table?
Would you like to have
Or-
casual conversation?
That's been my line for years. It's never worked.
Maybe this is the right context for it, and when you asked it before, it wasn't quite the thing.
Yeah, this is true. Or if anybody wanted, or a formal question to the whole group. Do the readers have a feeling about this?
Casual is nice.
Okay. So I think that.
Or casual questions.
No, it's got to be
for the whole group.
aggressive.
So we'll genuinely invite you to come and talk to the poets and fiction writers and poets and other things, and look at their books and ask them or say something about what they read. And we'll also invite you to have some lemonade and cookies if that's what you'd like to do. And many of you are writers, and I know that for me, sometimes the space after listening like that to just go find a place to sit by yourself and write in your notebook for 20 minutes, that it can be a really good time to do that. That something is activated. So I would also invite you to find a corner of the library and write in your notebook for 20 minutes after you say hello, or instead of saying hello, or as a way of saying hello in the invisible world of writing. So thank you very much. Thank you again to our readers and to all of you.